Hi, everybody. Dave Rauch here, CEO of ProTech Building Services, and welcome to today's The Maintenance Manager newsletter. And I'm here with Mitch Frumkin, and Mitch works for Kipcon Engineering. You're the founder and owner of
Founder and
Kipcon.
owner, yes.
And Mitch is from the East Coast, from New Jersey.
Yes.
And so maybe first, Mitch, you can tell us a little bit about your company, what services you provide to the community association industry, and a little bit about yourself. Of course, I know that you are also a comedian, so we'd love to hear a joke if you have one.
Now, maybe it's part of the conversation. I will.
Okay.
But Kipcon's an engineering consulting firm. I created it a number of years ago. I had black hair when I did that, and I was always looking for a way to start a business. As a matter of fact, to give you a little background even more, when I was in college, I went to Tulane in engineering school. And I was going for structural engineering, and I was always looking for a way to name a firm after what I do. And a lot of people ask me, where does Kipcon come from? So my sophomore year in Professor Johnson's structural engineering class, he said a measure of force in engineering is a kip, which is 1,000 pounds, which is 1,000 pounds. Like a ton is 2,000 pounds, but a kip is 1,000 pounds. So I sat there my first semester, sophomore year, and I said, Kip Consulting. And then by the end of that class, it turned into Kipcon. And when I went home from school that semester, I registered the name. So the Kipcon name it's a unit of force in engineering, but that's where it came from because I always wanted to have my own firm. So it's kind of interesting because people sometimes ask, where's the name come from? But so I started the firm. Actually, as soon as I graduated from college, I started doing engineering work on the side. And then I went out to dinner with my wife to an Italian restaurant, and we bumped into a friend of hers from high school who was married to a gentleman. And we started talking about what does he do, because he had just started his own business, and he started a business doing accounting for community associations. And he explained to me what it was, what a reserve study was, and that very few people do that. And having the entrepreneurial brain, which I think you have too, I immediately said, reserve studies, Kipcon. And I did some research on reserve studies and what community associations were. And that's where it all started. And back in the day, that's when the evolution or the development of community associations was just starting. I mean, now there's hundreds of thousands of them across the country. But I joined CAI, the local chapter. And within 3 months, they had me doing a seminar on transition studies and reserve studies to a packed audience of hundreds of people. And the reason they asked me is because nobody else did it.
Wow.
So that's where it started.
And that's where all this enthusiasm and volunteerism actually started way back then.
Way back then. I mean, it's just my personality. I mean, we've worked together that I kind of get enthusiastic about a lot of things.
Because I don't know if our viewers know, but you're very active in CAI.
Yes,
very active. And we'll go over that, your experience. But you do reserve studies, but you also do structural engineering.
We do reserve studies, we do transition studies, and we do structural and civil engineering. We do not do any work that involves new construction. It all has to do with existing buildings, new roofs, new facades, parking garage restoration. So that's a specialty that they do not teach you in school.
Gotcha.
They only, that's experience.
And just real quick, the comedy that you do, that was just a hobby?
Yeah, I like to try a lot of different things because I went to actually acting school because I wanted to be on TV, like everybody. And this only was about 10 years ago. And then they told me in my acting school, my teacher was one of the stars of SVU. I mean, there's a whole story behind that. But she said, you're too spontaneous to be an actor because you have to know your lines and all kinds of stuff. So she suggested I think of improv or comedy. So I did some research. I went to the American Comedy Institute in Manhattan, and I ended up performing at the Gotham Club and the Metropolitan Room, which I loved, but it just takes too much time. That's
great. And I hope you do some at your local chapter.
Well, they did have something a couple of years ago where I did do it, but it's so that I like to try all kinds of things.
Well, we first met, I think it was last year, it might have been the year before, on the task force, the CAI task force. They had 3 task forces that created the safety public policy report. And you were on the reserve, you chaired the reserve task force, and you chaired the Structural Inspection and Maintenance Task Force too, correct?
Right. What happened was, CAI is very, very proactive. I think that out of tragedies come some great things. And if it wasn't for the leadership at CAI, we wouldn't have the great things happening to keep our buildings from falling apart again, so to speak. But within a couple of weeks after the tragedy in Florida, CAI created a task force to do this condominium public policy safety thing.
Yeah, it's a long title.
And what they did is they know who's been involved in the industry, who has certain expertise. So they reached out to me to be a co-chair of that, which is broken out into 3 or 4 parts: reserve studies, structural integrity, and insurance.
Right.
And I co-chaired the structural integrity part, and I also kind of co-chaired the reserve part also. So I was very involved in that. As a matter of fact, CAI is in the process of updating the public policy paper right now, the report, because of different things that have happened in the industry since then, because this has been like a evolution to really get to the right answer. And about 2 weeks ago, they called me up and they said, we're updating this public policy safety report. Would I chair the task force to update it, which I'm doing now because I never say no to anything. So I'm doing that now. We've already met 3 times. So that's going to be updated.
That's great. And from this report, I know that CAI had met with all the state legislatures, and that some states slowly are starting to adopt some of the recommendations in here. Florida did. I think you mentioned New Jersey did, and Virginia and a few other states. What are your thoughts on the adoption by states of these recommendations?
Well, to show you how spectacular that is and how proactive CAI was or is, because it still is, it not was, which we'll talk about. But this is being used legislatively all over the country for legislation in regards to reserves, reserve funding, structural integrity, and maintenance, which I'm sure we'll talk about. As a matter of fact, in New Jersey, I'm on the Legislative Action Committee, and Senator Singleton, who's a pretty good guy, reached out to us for the legislation in New Jersey so that we can work with him to put together legislation based on this public policy. And it pretty much mimics it. It's pretty good legislation. Then about a few months after that, the state of Delaware is in the process of putting through legislation. They asked me to be on a task force for that, which I'm on still right now. And the legislation in Delaware, starting in Newcastle County, reflects pretty much this public policy also. So this public policy has really acted as a guide across the country for legislation regarding structural integrity, reserves, and maintenance, which has led to a couple of other things also that I'm sure you're going to ask me about.
I am. I just want to let everyone know, though, that this report is available for download on caionline.org, correct?
Yes, it's a free page.
Also on our website, we keep it there too with other important documents.
And it is going to be updated by the end of the summer.
That's great. That's great
Make
news.
it even better.
So after this ended, Dawn had asked you and I and a few other guys, John Epstein. She asked Stephen Brumfeld from Toll Brothers. John Epstein, of course, is a well-known attorney in San Diego, serving Southern California, and Gary Porter from Las Vegas to write best practices for maintenance. And so I believe we started last year.
Yes.
And we came up with this, and your contribution here was amazing. You pushed everybody. In addition to Dawn pushing, you pushed too. You asked a million
You did
questions.
a little pushing too.
But this just came out this week, right?
Today.
And today.
At the conference.
And at the conference. And I just wanted to get your thoughts, kind of looking back on that whole process that we went through, your thoughts on how it went, and then also your thoughts on how you think these might be implemented by the industry.
All right, well, you've asked 3 questions
in
that one sentence.
Okay.
But just to show you the initiative and the vision of CAI, when we were preparing the public policy report, it was pretty quickly determined that building safety is not just based on reserve studies. And one of the things that scared us was that after the collapse in Florida, the press was talking about reserve studies and how if this community had maintained adequate reserves, the collapse wouldn't have happened. We immediately recognized the fact that the press was getting it wrong, and that's not the facts. The fact is that the reserves are just one part of the equation. There's three parts to this. There's reserves, no question about it, but maintenance is hugely important. And the third part of it is periodic inspections to look at the structure. So in order to keep your building safe, you can't just do one of those. You have to have all three of them there. And that's pretty clear in the public policy report, because the public policy report talks about reserve studies and what you should do and how you should fund it. It talks about the connection to maintenance, and it talks about the periodic inspections. So what CAI did next was they said, okay, the public policy report says it. Now what we need to do is we need to be the leader in the industry when it comes to maintenance. And that's when they put together this task force to develop this best practices paper on maintenance based on the results of the public policy paper that connected the three together. So, but the question three from your sentence in terms of implementation, we've gotten to the point where it's done, the document is out there. The implementation is a huge question because, how do you get people around the country to use this? And as we're all aware, CAI has a number of classes. They teach all kinds of classes, level 300 class, all advanced level classes, which I teach a few of. But CAI needs to now incorporate this into all of their classes, if not have a separate class just on this, because when you come to a conference like this, there's about 1,200 people. It's up to these 1,200 people to now carry this information back across the country to implement it. But the implementation is a hard part. I'm a very strong believer in education is the number one step in implementation. And it's really, that's the tough part now, because the easy part is getting this done.
Right, because I think in some of our recommendations for legislation, there was talk about the maintenance manual, maintenance protocols, maintenance programs being implemented in legislation. And I think that was too difficult of a step without having the education first.
Well,
So,
the education
completely agree with you.
Absolutely. The education for the associations, there's a huge amount of associations. I think 350,000 associations in the country now. But on legislative side, I will tell you that, for example, in New Jersey and in Delaware, the legislation says that when the developer creates a new community, not only do they have to put into their governing documents, the disclosure documents, a requirement for reserves, but the developer needs to set up a maintenance plan for the association. So they're not only reserving for replacement, but they're maintaining it in addition to that, which is a big step through the legislation.
That's a big step.
Yes, and it is in legislatively. The harder part is getting managers and boards across the country to understand.
Absolutely. And I think that's going to take a few years.
It's going to take a while.
It's going to take a while.
Yeah.
Now, one of the great things working with you on the best practice report on maintenance committee was the fact that you were also, I think you were a co-chair or chair of the new reserve study standard committee. And so it was back and forth. You were back and forth on both committees. You were taking things that you had learned in the maintenance committee, you were taking them to the reserve committee and really refining both. And I thought that was really just a great opportunity there.
Well, that was, I think, very important, because when CAI first developed the National Reserve Study Standards, I co-chaired the committee back in a few years ago. When they updated it a couple of years ago, I co-chaired that committee. When they went based on the public policy report, it was agreed that we need to update the reserve study standards also. So they put together a group of people to co-chair, which I was one of them. And since I was also on the maintenance task force for the best policy paper, there are so many connections between the two.
Right.
That I said, if I can, let me be on the other one too, so we make sure that all the terminology is in sync. And because of that, the terminology in here is now in sync with what we say in there, or it wouldn't have been. And not because I was there, but because somebody needed to be there to be the connection between the two.
That was great.
It was a great move on behalf of CAI.
Yeah.
I don't know if they picked the right person to do it, but it is connected, the terminology.
Yeah. And the things that you have come up with, now I haven't read this. This is the new, is this the copy?
That
new
is being
reserve
introduced at
study
conference also.
Introduced today?
Today, I
Or
got
tomorrow?
that this morning.
Fantastic. And I'd love to get a copy. But from what I learned from Dawn Bauman, who was also on both committees, right?
Dawn was our boss.
She was
Dawn
our
was the
boss
staff
in both
head,
committees.
and the committees are made up of lay leaders, I'll call them,
Right.
volunteers. But from the staff perspective, it was Dawn.
And she was on both like you.
Yes, but she's
And
not really on it.
I understand. Yeah.
She's our boss, but she's not on it.
Yeah. She's the liaison, maybe?
She's liaison to staff and the
Yeah.
national board. Yes.
Right. And she had told me that there's three things, but you had mentioned there's actually more, three important things that these new reserve studies do, the reserve study update changes. So do you have a minute? Can you tell us a little bit about those changes?
Well, absolutely. The key is that we agreed that reserve studies are not standalone to keep your building safe. So the question is, how do we connect everything that needs to be done? For example, you need to connect maintenance, which I talked about, and we need to connect structural integrity. So the task of our task force was to update the standards to clarify anything that we need to in there, but to connect the three. So the standards now very specifically connect them, and I'll tell you how. That from the perspective of maintenance, it's by disclosure. So the reserve providers are not going to be doing maintenance plans unless they have the qualifications, but when doing a reserve study, you need to talk to your client to find out what they do for maintenance, if anything, and include in their report as part of the disclosures whether or not the community does any type of maintenance. If the association does or does not do maintenance, it then is incorporated into the study and reflected in the useful lives of the components. So for example, if you have a wood deck with a 20-year life and they do maintenance, then maybe we'll keep it as 20 years. But if they don't do maintenance, we may reduce the useful life to 15 years because they're not maintaining it. So it has a direct impact on the cost that the community is paying by doing maintenance, which is a whole other story. So from a maintenance perspective, it's a disclosure and an adjustment to the useful lives. From the structural integrity perspective, the public policy is very clear which type of buildings need to have structural integrity inspections done and how frequently they need to be done. So the reserve study now needs to include for those type of buildings in the study, structural integrity inspection every 10 years or whatever it is, the approximate cost so that the association is funding to have it done. So now the reserve study will include a direct connection to the structural integrity inspections, as well as a direct connection to maintenance in terms of the useful lives. So this standard now connects all three.
That's awesome.
Yes.
That's awesome. And I always love to use the example of the Disneyland fence along Main Street, which Disney actually repaints that fence, I've heard daily, nightly, at night or weekly, whatever it is, but they repaint that fence all the time and they're not going to replace it ever. It's never going to deteriorate, so you don't have to put aside any reserves on something that's never going to go away. But it's always good. I'm sure maybe they might replace it at 50 years just to get a new fence, so reserves are still critical. But I use that as an example often.
It's a great example because people think that maintenance will make sure something attains its useful life, like that wood deck at 20 years. But if you do preventive maintenance, it might last 25 years or 30 years. So the cost of it is amortized over that many more years. But there are a couple other things that were added to the standards in terms of clarifications and things like that based on the new standards. If you want me to, I can give a couple of examples.
I'd love it.
For example, right now, the reserve study is based on essentially what you can see. But we know that a lot of buildings, especially high rises, have a lot of common elements behind the walls that you can't see that may not be included in the study.
Plumbing, electrical, sewer laterals.
Absolutely, which costs a lot of money. So now the standards say that the study needs to include not only things you can see, but if you know there are things behind the walls, you now need to include them in the study somehow, which is a whole other story of how do you quantify them if you can't see them. So it requires that being in the study. It also says, it used to be that there was something called the 30-year rule, which the reserve studies include all components that require replacement within 30 years. And then as the communities get older, and now the 30-year window goes out further, you may need to add things to the study. Now, a couple things have changed in here. It used to be that an update said you update a prior study, which was very easy because you knew it was in the study. But now it says if now things fall within that 30-year time frame or longer, they need to be included as part of an update, not an option. It also says that when you do a new study, it needs to include all components that are measurable past that 30-year window.
Oh, I see.
So everything is going to be included now.
Everything's included.
It's included now, which makes a big difference. And there's a few different ways to do it, but now it recognizes the fact that this 30-year window, or the 30-year rule, some people called it, is really not something that is a good rule, essentially, because there are things that need to be added that weren't being added. So
Fascinating.
So there are a number of nice changes that are made to this, but the question becomes implementation again when it comes to this.
And we'll touch on that, but I want to talk about concrete, because that's one of those long-lived components, which is still has a finite life. But concrete, like for the instance in Champlain Towers in Surfside, the concrete, the rebar was getting wet because the pool deck was not properly waterproofed and other areas weren't properly waterproofed. And as we know, concrete is pervious to water. So water went through the concrete and rusted the rebar. And when rebar rusts, it can expand to 40 times its size, which causes the spalling of the concrete. Now, that's a structural issue. It causes a degradation to the structure, I'm assuming. I'm not a structural engineer, but that's something, when you see that as a structural engineer, you're going to say, hey, this needs to be fixed. This needs some kind of maintenance. Can you talk about that for a sec?
Keep in mind that as you said, when steel gets wet, it rusts and it expands. But another thing happens from a structural perspective. Let's say that piece of steel, that reinforcing steel, is 1 square inch of steel, giving it the strength. As it rusts, that area decreases, so it has less strength. So a couple things, for example, in the reserve study standard that has changed is, for example, everybody looks at a reserve study and says it has to be replaced every 10 years. It's a cyclical thing. But now it says that if there's something that's not cyclical, it needs to be added. For example, if somebody goes out and looks at a structure and there's a structural integrity report done, which we've talked about, and that structural integrity report says you need to do corrective maintenance to fix this, and you only need to do it once to the structure, the reserve provider should look at that structural integrity report and add the fixing of the concrete in those areas to the study based on what it says in the structural integrity report. The other thing is, from a maintenance perspective, this is going to be interesting because right now, most people, when they build communities, and let's say it's concrete, they don't put a sealant on the concrete. And because they don't put a sealant, it's not protecting the water from getting in and rusting out the reinforcing. Now we're talking about maintenance and what should be done to have these things have a longer life and structural integrity. So I think you're going to see changes in the way people build things, and maybe even the code will change to require that some type of membrane will have to be added. And then that will be put into the reserve study that needs to be replaced every 5 or 10 years. So there's so many different things that are going on here that the dust is still settling on. How is this going to be implemented and what other changes are going to come next?
Yeah, it's somewhat complex.
It's complex, but there's a lot of logic to most of it.
Let me use one other example too, which is a common example that I think everybody would be able to relate to, and that's maintenance of a roof and the replacement of a roof. So as a reserve study preparer, you would say, okay, in 30 years, let's say, we're going to replace this roof at a cost of $30 million. But if we can do an annual roof maintenance, which is, cleaning gutters and downspouts, masticing around all the roof penetrations, replacing any broken or missing shingles, tiles, or concrete tiles, if you can do that, you might be able to get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 more years of life out of that roof. And so then, instead of costing $1 million a year for that $30 million roof, you're actually reducing the cost by extending the life. Now, my question is, are reserve preparers going to be able to capture that changed reserve for that type of component, which is a big one?
Well, one of the things that people don't recognize, that when you're doing maintenance, it's not just a matter of doing something. It's a matter of inspecting to see if you need to do something.
Right.
And when you're talking about roofs, for example, I'm involved in a lot of projects with flat roof, shingle roofs, but shingle roofs as an example. when shingles start curling,
Mm-hmm.
when you get, in my part of the world, where you get ice and snow on the roof, which expands and damages the flashing.
Mm-hmm.
When these type of things happen, as part of a preventive maintenance program based on these inspections, you should fix them for a couple of reasons. The first is, as you said, then you'll get the useful life out of the roof. That's the easy answer.
Yep.
But the other thing is, and I'm going to go off on a tangent for a second, a lot of people think of maintenance as being one word. There's a few different types of maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
There's preventive maintenance, which is something you plan and you do it to get the useful lives. And that's what I was just talking about. Look at it, fix it.
Mm-hmm.
There's deferred maintenance, which means you don't do anything. And instead of getting a 30-year life, you get a 20-year life, and it costs you a lot more. And you have to have a special assessment, all kinds of
You better have reserves then.
Well, a reserve isn't going to help you for that unless the reserve provider, based on the new standard, says no maintenance, I'm reducing the useful life, which now it's connected. But the other thing is that people need to think about is what's called corrective maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
Corrective maintenance means when you see a problem, you fix it.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why that's so critical is that there are consequential damages that happen if you don't do preventive maintenance or do what we're just talking about. For example, if you don't fix a roof and the water starts getting in, the underlying structure is going to get wet, get damaged, and it need to be fixed.
Mm-hmm.
So now what happens is, if you take the cost of preventive maintenance versus corrective maintenance costs a significantly more amount of money. And studies have shown that if you have to fix something instead of maintaining it, it's going to cost you at least 30 times more than the cumulative cost of the preventive maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
So preventive maintenance is not only extending or maintaining or keeping the useful lives, but it's also keeping you from having to fix things that will cause a significant expense that you can't plan for.
Yeah.
So that brings you to the terminology life cycle cost.
Mm-hmm.
Life cycle cost does not take into account the cost of corrective maintenance. And corrective maintenance is something that is a huge cost that people need to understand, that preventive maintenance is going to save them in the life of their community a huge amount of money if they do it. And it's going to cost a lot less than if they have to fix it.
Right, exactly. It's the inspections first,
Yes.
any corrective maintenance found in the inspection, and then, of course, the preventive maintenance to lengthen the
That's
life.
absolutely.
Ultimately, painting and roof maintenance are the two big examples.
Absolutely. That's why the beauty of the public policy is it ties everything
Yeah.
together and explains them.
And you brought up a great point, which is the cost. And I think for most boards of directors that this is the big challenge. They think their job is to not spend any money or keep the monthly assessments low. Whereas nothing could be further from the truth. Their job is to maintain, protect, and enhance that community, the physical elements of the community primarily. And so the hard part for a reserve preparer and a community association manager is to explain to the board of directors, look, you have to spend money on inspections, corrective maintenance, and preventive maintenance to avoid paying a huge amount of money down the road if you do nothing. I mean, the extreme example of that is Champlain Towers South in Surfside, where the insurance, I think, wasn't it a $2 billion loss?
I don't know.
Plus 98 people. So that's one extreme example of the cost for not inspecting, maintaining. And so are reserve preparers ready to have that discussion with boards, or is that something just community association managers are tasked with? Because that's tough. Boards have to, have a paradigm shift in understanding that it takes money to save money.
But you have to keep in mind the problem in our industry, which is people don't look at life cycle costs.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason they don't do that is because most people live in a community association. Let's say they're there for 7 years or 8 years, which I think is the average life before they move on to something else.
Right.
So while they're living there, why do they want to pay? I'm saying this hypothetically. Why do they want to pay for a roof that is going to have to be replaced 10 years after they leave? So what they do is, the mindset is, let's not raise our maintenance fees. Let's keep our reserve funds, if we have them, at a steady level, and we're at a lower than adequate level, or let the next person who moves in. And
Yeah.
I always give the example that they don't have reserves. They live in the community for 19 years. They move out. Somebody moves in the next year, There's a special assessment to replace the roof, and they're paying for a roof somebody else lived under for 19 years.
Exactly.
But it's a mindset in this industry where it's very important that the managers and the board members and people understand this, but then it always comes back to how much is it costing me as I live here today?
Yeah.
Well, there's other communities that there are people that live there and they're on fixed incomes.
Mm-hmm.
And I've run into that also. But the thing that they have to keep in mind is property values.
Mm-hmm.
When they do move after 7 years, if they don't maintain it, if they don't keep it up to date, if they don't do these things, they're not going to get as much for their home as they would if they did. And I think there's another study that we talk about in the best practices paper that preventive maintenance at a minimum increases your property values by about 1% a year.
Mm-hmm.
And people need to take that into account when they're reducing
Yeah.
that, because it comes back to them when they sell.
Exactly. And that's a great example. But I think the examples of like a roof or a smaller component and the savings they can get in those instances are the stories that we need to be telling over and over and over, because the community association manager has to remember those to explain to the board, the savings that could be there, because they don't want to spend money.
Right. And I think that
they're dead set against increasing assessments.
Yeah. And as you know, one of the big things in our industry is risk. And I think the more you educate managers, there's a risk that if they don't put documents, you need to fix this, and then next week it starts leaking. And then the board is going to come back and say, well, why didn't you make us fix this? Because it's leaking.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, well, we told you it's going to cost more money. So there's all kinds of things going on, but it all comes down to money in one way or another.
Right. And I think ultimately we really have to work on the education piece, as you outlined. But I think it's important that not only educating the community association managers on how the boards can save money in the long term with maintenance inspections and structural inspections and reserves, but also explain that to the reserve study preparers. So you actually have a team, so the reserve study preparers know those stories, know those examples, and so they can also talk about that to their clients too.
I think that's a great point. Right now, there's, I think, about 300 reserve specialists around the country.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a CAI designation saying that you know how to do reserve studies, essentially. So there's about 300 of them across the country. Keep in mind, to be a reserve specialist, you do not need to be an engineer.
Mm-hmm.
But there are certain qualifications. But we're coming out with the new standards on reserve studies, which they'll all know about because they've all been asked for input. But not all of them know about the connection to the best practices paper on maintenance and how they connect. And one of the things I think CAI should do, and I haven't started bugging about this yet, but I will, is we need to do a webinar somehow to all the RSs across the country to educate them on exactly what we're talking about, because that's the way that it gets to their clients. Not only how the reserve study standards have changed, but the connection between maintenance, the connection to life cycle costs, the connection to useful lives, all the things we talked about. We have to educate the professionals who do the reserve studies, just like the managers.
That'd be awesome if we could do that.
I was actually in a seminar. I was in a seminar last week, and an accountant was speaking, and he was using the term deferred maintenance to describe preventive maintenance.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I didn't mean to embarrass him, but I pointed out that deferred means you don't do it. Preventive means you do.
Yeah. Well, I am absolutely passionate about improving quality of life for people that live in condos like Champlain Towers. A lot of people there had lived there their entire lives, and they couldn't move out. They couldn't sell their unit because where would they go? I'm also passionate about condominiums, and because I feel that condominiums are a great entryway to homeownership, to the American dream, saving equity in a home for lower and middle income people, but also for young people just starting out having a family. I think it's critical that we, as an industry, do whatever we can to promote condominiums. And I think any help the reserve profession can give the industry on that would be awesome. Do you have any thoughts on how we can promote condominiums?
Well,
and I'm talking about attached.
Okay, well, first I want to comment that I work on many associations where it's a very high-end caliber in terms of wealth, people that live there. And of course, condos or community associations can be considered entry level because the scale of price for these things range from low price to high price.
Good point.
There are a huge amount of very high-end condos. I work on some of them where it's not just entry level, I promise.
Gotcha.
But as far as the question was, how do we promote this to condos? Or I went off track.
Yeah, how do we
read back the
promote
question,
the
please?
development of more condominiums in the country when insurance costs are going up, when developers don't want to build condos because of construction defect litigation, because there's all issues. There's a bunch of issues with condominiums.
Well, there's a bunch of issues.
And maintenance is only one of them.
Okay, but I will say that the glass for condos is much, much more half full than it is empty. For example, there are more positives to community association living, which condos are just a type of community association, but there are more positives than negatives. All you read about in the press is the bad stuff. Now, look across the country, what's going on. There's 370,000 associations across this country. If you take an average across this country, if I'm not mistaken, about 80% of for sale attached residential units are being built as a community association. In my neck of the woods in the Northeast, probably about 100% of what's being built that is for sale is some type of association. The reasons for that are many. I mean, for example, from the municipal perspective, they don't want to have to maintain the roads, those kind of things. So they want them to be associations because then people are paying for it. So condo living, community association living is here to stay. It's going to continue getting bigger and bigger and bigger, no question in my mind. And you can see it. If you look back in the mid-'70s, there were, I think, 10,000 associations across the country. Now there's 350,000 associations. Every one of them needs to maintain. They need to reserve. They need to check for safety. But I don't think, not agree with you, but I don't think we have to worry about the community association / condo market going away. It's here to stay. It's how do we make sure that it's done right and that the life cycle cost, safety, property values, all of these things are maintained.
Yeah, I think we get some of these things implemented, and I think condo living will be a little easier. And
I have a friend who just moved into a community association because they don't want to have to worry about maintenance.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's because that's a perspective people have, a perception.
Yeah.
They're moving into a place now as vinyl siding. It doesn't have wood siding and all that kind of stuff. So the maintenance costs, and they don't want to have to worry about hiring somebody or shoveling their sidewalks. So there's huge advantages to it that people see.
But I just want to thank you so much for all the work you've done to improve and shape this industry. And thank you very much for this
I
interview.
appreciate it. You can tell I have a passion for this stuff, so I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
Obviously see it. So thanks very much, man.
Thank you.